2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Tuesdays are the day where we kick things off by having a look at the world of politics with our Professor of Politics, Dr. Jim Joson. Jim, not a bad day to sort of come in because state budget has crept up on us yet again.
Good morning, Mark. Yep, the state budget will be delivered formally this morning by the Treasurer, and we'll get to see a bit more of the detail. And I mean, interested people can then sort of scour through the budget papers and keep themselves up at night with the detail. But I think that it's looking pretty good, all things considered. I mean, that the juggling act that the state government have to do is to make good on the promises that they made in the election campaign. And it appears that they have the capacity at present, with the state being relatively debt-free compared to other states, and having what looks like a surplus of around about $800 million. So that's plenty for the government to be able to play with. It gives them a bit of leeway. There are a few negatives on the horizon that they need to be mindful about, because state revenue is dropping a little bit. Some of the income from, for example, stamp duty, given the property downturn at present, or I think we should more correctly say, given a sort of market correction to some extent, because the property market's been quite
massively inflated, hasn't it?
Quite inflated. Yeah. So it's sort of shrinking a little bit, which brings it back to a sort of perhaps more reasonable level. I mean, that's arguable, I suppose. But the revenue that the state government would get from stamp duty, of course, declines. Also is the issue of the GST sharing arrangement with the Commonwealth. The New South Wales government share is dropping a little bit, and although there's an agreement that the state will be no worse off than before, some of the revenue is not going to be available for them, the anticipated revenue. So those sorts of things are sitting, shall we say, in the background. But at present, with an $800 million surplus, yes, it's a little smaller than predicted, but they predicted an $840 million surplus anyway. So in the scheme of things, that's not too drastic.
50 million, yes, but again, 800 million in the bank once you consider all the bills are paid, all of the services that just have to be paid by state governments are all committed to for another year. So there are some differences, Jim, in between state and federal budgets if they sort of need to get some more money. So for those who might not be completely au fait with how they work, what are some of those distinct differences?
Well, at the state level, it's much more like a household budget where they're dependent on their revenue and needing to balance that expenditure against that revenue.
In other words, the paycheck comes in, you pay the bills, and what's left you get an ice cream.
Yes, if you're lucky. So there's that dimension of it. Now, of course, states can borrow, and they've been able to do that in the past, but with the GST arrangements, the sort of strategy, I suppose you could call it, is that they don't need to borrow as much. The difference, though, with at the Commonwealth level, because the Commonwealth government is the issuer of currency, they have fiat control over the currency. If they need more money, they can print it off. Now, there are constraints around that. There are risks about that, and so governments are loathed in many respects to just simply print money. But when it comes to their budget, they're not bound by the same constraints that states are bound by, so that Commonwealth governments can expand their spending if they need to in various situations, and we've seen it happen quite often where Commonwealth governments have needed money in a hurry. I think the establishment of offshore detentions was one area. There are others where they're able to sort of find the money in ways that state governments can't. So the constraints around the state government are that they're much more dependent upon their revenue. At present, for New South Wales, it looks, from the Treasurer's perspective and from the government's perspective, that their revenues are going to maintain a very healthy level. The prediction that they're basing their spending on is that over the next 4 years, they're looking at around about $1.5 to $1.7 billion in surplus. So that's a very, very healthy cushion. But at the same time, we also hear that the Treasurer is looking to make savings in the spending. And at one level, that's a sensible thing, Mark. I mean, that all Treasurers should be sort of looking to ensure that their spending is not extravagant, and that if there are savings to be made, they can do it. The question is whether the savings themselves, that's to say whether the cuts that might be made to affect those savings are the right sorts of cuts and the necessary ones. At present, the Treasurer is suggesting that the salary savings that they're looking at with the various cuts that they're anticipating, that those cuts will come from redundancies and voluntary retirements and all of those, and natural attrition. Now, if that's the case, that's fine. But there is one, I think, dimension here that the government is promising to expand positions and so forth in teaching and health and so on, and all that is what people expect. But there's a dimension to the staffing levels in the public sector, for example, where services themselves start to decline if you cut, if you just simply don't replace positions. And there are numerous examples where departments and agencies have been struggling to deliver the services because they don't have adequate staff, and the staffs have been reduced through various forms of attrition and so on. So there's shall we say, an underside to that. Now, I guess with projections of surpluses, the pressure to reduce staffing levels should perhaps be eased back, but then that's a political decision at some point that the government may need to make or may need to consider. But it's certainly the case that simply reducing staffing levels to affect cuts doesn't necessarily mean that in the long run you've saved anything in dollar terms, because if the services can't be delivered effectively, then there are other complications and other hidden costs. And of course, when we look at the infrastructure spending and some of the other measures in the budget, there's the issue of, a lot of these things, budgets blow out.
And again, is that always kind of the eternal argument back to where we started? I guess, yes, we want to cut and we want to see budgets in surplus. We don't want governments to be spending a lot of money, but we need those services to go on. So interesting times.
We I guess, end up paying for what we get. And
true.
So I guess, and those sorts of decisions end up becoming political rather than economic.
As they always do, Jim. We'll have a look at politics again next week. Thank you for coming in.
Yeah, my pleasure.